Negative feedback is pulling in from chapter 1 when we looked at um, metabolism and control of the body for hormone levels. This is where it's at. So do you remember we talked about calcitonin? And I'm looking for that image. Here we go. So in looking at the buildup or breakdown of bone, which we studied in chapter 5, you've got the thyroid gland, which will release calcitonin. The thyroid is an endocrine gland. Calcitonin is a hormone. It stimulates calcium to be deposited into the bone. So what that'll do is, if you remember, it will decrease blood calcium levels, which will then affect the parathyroid hormones to initiate osteoclast works to degrade bone to increase the calcium levels. And that's the negative feedback, is as you build bone, calcium levels drop, it's picked up by the parathyroids, which sends out a hormone to initiate the osteoclasts to begin working, which will then in turn shut off the calcitonin. There is your negative feedback. That is how most endocrine glands control and maintain the appropriate level of hormones within the blood. Oh, there we go. Okay, so your stimuli that activates fall into 3 major categories. You've got your hormonal, your humoral, and your neural. Looking at hormonal stimuli, it is your endocrine glands are activated by other hormones. For example, your anterior pituitary hormones travel to target glands, such as the thyroid gland, that prompt the release of a hormone, such as thyroid hormone. Let's look at that. So you've got the hypothalamus secretes a hormone that stimulates the anterior pituitary to increase its hormones. It's one hormone stimulates another gland that releases another hormone that stimulates another gland to secrete their hormones. A hormone stimulates a hormone stimulates a hormone. That's your hormonal stimulus. You've got your humoral stimulus, and that's the changing blood levels. That's where your calcitonin feedback is happening. So you've got changing blood levels of certain ions or nutrients will stimulate the hormone release. Humoral, looking at the humors of the body in historical medical treatment, are the various body fluids such as blood and bile. Your example is the one I just gave earlier with your parathyroid hormone and your calcitonin being released in response to changing blood calcium levels. Insulin is another example of this. Here's your picture. You've got your capillary blood. Calcium concentration stimulates the parathyroid to decrease the calcium concentration within the blood. Your third one is your neural stimulus. Your nerve impulses stimulating the hormone release. This is where norepinephrine and epinephrine come into play. This is what's happening in your adrenals with your stress hormones. Most of these are under your sympathetic nervous system, your sympathetic nervous system being the nervous system that you have no control over. And there is your picture, central spinal cord, preganglia. All right, these are your major endocrine organs. These are your major players: your pineal gland, your hypothalamus, pituitary, thyroid, parathyroid, thymus, pancreas, adrenals, and your gonads. From top to bottom, this is where they are. Your pineal gland, hypothalamus, and pituitary glands are all located in your brain. Your thyroid and parathyroids and your thymus are throat and chest. Adrenals live right above the kidney, and your pancreas is a digestive organ as well as an endocrine organ. And then obviously your reproductive organs. Some glands are purely endocrine. Those are your anterior pituitary, your thyroid, your adrenals, and parathyroids. Your endocrine glands are ductless glands. The hormones are released directly into the blood or the lymph. They don't pass go. They do not collect $200. It goes right into the blood. It's immediate. It's not necessarily an immediate effect, but the release is immediate into the blood. All other of your glands are mixed glands, which means they have both endocrine and exocrine functions, meaning your pancreas and your gonads. Let's look at the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. They kind of have a symbiotic relationship. I'd like to think of them as a ship's captain sitting in a bridge of the ship, controlling everything on that ship. And your hypothalamus is kind of like your first mate. Specifically, look at the anterior and posterior pituitary. The pituitary hangs from the hypothalamus by a stalk. It's protected by the sphenoid bone. So here's your hypothalamus. Here is your anterior pituitary, your posterior pituitary, and it all sits below the cross bridges for the optic chiasma. Going back up, here we go. So it hangs, and you've got the hypothalamus that produces releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones. These hormones are then released into a portal circulation which connects directly to the anterior pituitary. It is specific to those two endocrine organs. The hypothalamus also itself makes two hormones. Those hormones are oxytocin, which are involved in childbirth, and antidiuretic hormone, which controls the kidneys. Those two hormones are formed in the hypothalamus. They are carried to the posterior pituitary and stored there by neurosecretory cells. They stay there and wait for when they are needed. So your hypothalamus to your posterior pituitary, your anterior pituitary. Let's talk about oxytocin. Oxytocin stimulates the contractions of the uterus during labor. They stimulate the contractions during labor. They also stimulate contractions during sexual relations and breastfeeding. All right, oxytocin also causes milk ejection, which is the letdown reflex in breastfeeding women. A newborn baby cries and a woman's milk lets down in preparation for child breastfeeding. Moving on to ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. ADH inhibits urine production, or diuresis. What it does is it's released and then it binds to the kidneys to increase the amount of water that the kidneys are taking and filtering, which then decreases the amount of urine that a person is producing. In large amounts, it causes vasoconstriction, which leads to increasing your blood pressure. It is actually clinically used as the drug vasopressin, and is a blood pressure controller. Alcohol inhibits ADH secretion. This increases urine production, but it also increases the amount of water that a person loses while they're drinking. That obviously leads to the hangover the next day, and why when somebody has a binge drinking experience, they wake up incredibly thirsty. It also is related to diabetes insipidus because ADH hyposecretion causes a person to have to pee more, which is one of the big symptoms of type 1 diabetes. That ADH hyposecretion, or decrease in ADH production, definitely causes an increase in urination. So if we look at the anterior and posterior, here's your posterior lobe with your ADH, which targets the kidney tubules, the oxytocin, which targets your mammary glands and your uterine muscles. We move on to the anterior lobe of the pituitary. The anterior lobe of the pituitary, there's 6 hormones. 2 affect non-endocrine targets. 4 of them affect endocrine targets. The 2 that affect non-endocrine targets are your growth hormone and your prolactin. The four that affect your endocrine glands, they are your trophic hormones. They are thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone. So let's look at the characteristics of all anterior hormones, things that they have in common. They are protein structures. They act through second messengers. So being a protein means that they can't pass through the cell wall or the cellular membrane. So they need to bind to a protein on that membrane to then go through that second messenger system to create that cascade to change how the cell is working. It is regulated by hormonal stimuli, which means as the production of the hormone increases, it goes until it changes, and then there's a homeostasis balance change, which will then affect a negative feedback loop in order to decrease the original stimulus and control the effects. Here is a image. There's your anterior pituitary, your portal system, which releases the hormones into the blood system. So you've got your growth hormone, which again is a non-endocrine target. It targets your bones and your muscles for growth. You've got your prolactin that targets your mammary glands, your follicle stimulating, and your luteinizing hormones, which target your gonads or your reproductive organs, thyrotropic hormone, thyroid, and adrenocorticotropic hormone, which stimulates your adrenal cortex. All right, let's move on to the anterior pituitary and growth hormone. Growth hormone is a general metabolic hormone, but it affects the growth of your skeletal muscles and your long bones. What it does is it plays a role in determining how big you're going to grow or how small you're going to grow. It causes amino acids to be built into proteins, which means it triggers the growth of your muscles, and it causes fats to be broken down as a source of energy. Looking at growth hormones and having growth hormone decide whether you're going to be tall or short, that growth, that end game in how big a person is. There's some disorders that are associated with growth hormone. You've got pituitary dwarfism, which is a hyposecretion of growth hormone during child, which means they're just not getting enough growth hormone for your muscles and bones to grow longer, which causes a shorter person or a shorter stature. Gigantism is the opposite of pituitary dwarfism, which means you have too much growth hormone being secreted. As opposed to gigantism and pituitary dwarfism being effects of childhood growth hormone variations, you've got acromegaly, which actually results from too much growth hormone during adults. So if we look at these two people, you have got somebody standing 8 feet 1 inches tall, that is gigantism, and then you've got somebody standing essentially 2.5 feet tall, that's pituitary dwarfism. Andre the Giant was an example of somebody who had the issue with gigantism or too much growth hormone as a child. Moving on to prolactin. Prolactin stimulates and maintains milk production after childhood. They don't know what the function of it is in males. So you've got let's go back to oxytocin. So you've got oxytocin, which causes the milk letdown reflex. Yes, it's active during labor and breastfeeding, but let's talk about the milk ejection. That is oxytocin, so that gets it started. The other side of it is prolactin, which also helps to get started, but what it does is it continues the milk production. It's what keeps it going. You've got your adrenocorticotropic hormone. That basically regulates the activity of the adrenal cortex. Really quite simple, not so complicated. You've got your thyrotrophic hormone, or TH. It's also called thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. It influences or controls the growth and activity of the thyroid gland. And then you've got your gonadotropic hormones. They regulate the activity of your sexual organs. Follicle stimulating hormones stimulates the follicle development and sperm development in ovaries and testes respectively. And then your luteinizing hormone triggers ovulation in females and stimulates testosterone production in males. Your thyroid gland, found at the base of the throat, here, produces 2 hormones. So we've gone through and you've got your thyroid stimulating hormone. That comes from the pituitary. But then when we jump down and we look at the thyroid gland, the TSH or the TH affects how much of the hormones the thyroid is going to produce. Those hormones are thyroid hormone and calcitonin. The thyroid consists of 2 lobes, here and here. And the connecting tissue, or the connection between it, is called the isthmus of the thyroid gland. It lays over the trachea with your carotid arteries going laterally. It also lies just above your subclavian, so it sits right in your throat. You can actually palpate it. So if you were to take your hands and feel for your voice box and then laterally go out to the side, you will feel the lobes of your thyroid sitting right there. In some people, it can be bigger. In others, it's just a variation. But if you gently palpate that, you'll know exactly where it is. Your thyroid hormone is a major metabolic hormone. It is what controls the homeostasis and balance within the body. It controls the rate of oxidation of your glucose. So it controls your body heat, it controls your energy, it's needed for growth and development, and there's 2 active forms of the hormone. There are 2 different hormones. You've got T4 and T3. Thyroxine is secreted by your thyroid follicles, and your triiodothyronine, it's a mouthful, triiodothyronine, is a conversion of T4 at the target tissue. So basically what happens is your thyroxine is released by your thyroid gland. It hits the tissue, the target tissue, and is immediately converted to T3 at the target tissue. So here's your follicle cells here, and here's your so this is a microscope or a micrograph of the thyroid gland. And you've got your follicular cells here and your colloid-filled follicles. Those are the follicles that are actually filled with T4 before it's released from the thyroid. There are a couple of issues that can be found with thyroid hormone. You've got goiters. Goiters are an enlarged thyroid gland, usually happens because of a lack of iodine. This is why our salt in the US is iodized, because goiters used to be very common historically, and in order to prevent it, the FDA decided or set guidelines that salt should be iodized in order to prevent this issue. If we look at the next picture, this is a picture of a woman with a goiter. All right, you've got your cretinism, which is a decrease in thyroxine secretion. It results when it happens during childhood, it results in dwarfism. So you've got several forms of dwarfism. You've got dwarfism that's controlled by growth hormone, but now you also have dwarfism that's controlled by a lack of thyroxine as a child. There's your picture of the goiter lady again. Moving on, you've got thyroid hormone disorders. You've got myxedemia, which is hypothyroidism in adults. Usually it happens in middle-aged women, they become very tired, very sluggish, and it's a slowdown. Then there's Grave disease, which is the opposite. It's hyperthyroidism. It results in increase in metabolism, uh, decrease to tolerance of being hot. It increases heart rate, increases weight loss. Whereas myxedema or hypothyroidism will produce the opposite in adults. They become cold, their heart rate slows down, they tend to gain weight. In Graves' disease, you'll have exophthalmos, which means, a fancy way of saying your eyes bulge. Next picture shows that. So it's a bulging eye. Calcitonin, decrease in blood calcium levels, and we've talked about this, causes calcium deposition in bone. It's antagonistic to parathyroid hormones. They are produced by parafollicular cells found between the follicles. So again, if we look, there are tiny masses on the posterior of the thyroid. You can palpate them because if you feel